Welcome to the Ascend Leadership Monthly webinar series, where we explore real-world skills and everyday experiences that shape how we lead. This month, we're making decisions. We're not making them, we're talking about making decisions. And we do that every day. What we prioritize, what are we going to say or not say? When do we speak up? Even doing nothing's a decision, right? Sometimes choices are easy. Other times they feel kind of heavy. They're consequences, they're risks. And frankly, sometimes we just want to try to get it right. You take a little bit of time. The thing about leadership, I'm going to give y'all all a tip. We never have 100% of the information, right? This is true. And I will say that over and over again, because leadership doesn't come from knowing the answers. It comes from how we make decisions, how we navigate, go through and weigh the trade-offs, listen to our values, all of that. So today, what are we unpacking? What drives our decisions? And then what holds us back? And how can we lead even though we can't always see what's coming up ahead? How do we do that with intention and feel confident along the way? Now, I'm going to ask you all, put your questions and your comments in the chat and get your fingers ready, because there is a moment I'm going to sit quietly despite my constant need to chatter, right? I'm going to ask you all to reflect for a moment, and I'd love for you to drop your reflections in the chat. That would be fantastic. In the Q&A, sorry. So with that, let me introduce myself. I am Jana, ATN. I had a 26+ year career in public accounting. Today, I'm a consultant, speaker, and trainer. My work is focused on something I call fearless inclusion, and I define that as the freedom to be yourself and the ability to create space for others to do the same. Of course, that's going to happen when I'm talking. So part of being fearless is showing up with clarity, curiosity, and courage, especially when those moments require us to make choices, and sometimes hard choices. I developed trainings and workshops focused on the inner work of leadership. That's authenticity, intentionality, culture building, inclusivity, ensuring equity, conscious communications, all of that. Because how we lead, especially when we're making decisions, that's all going to start from within. My passion is helping business professionals build deep connections, cultivate safety, and thrive as mindful, inclusive, and trusted leaders. This monthly series is built around the Ascend leadership model, which I created to reframe how we think about leadership. Instead of approaching leadership training through the mastery of skills and techniques, those are actually important. What I want to do, however, is integrate leadership into a more holistic framework. So instead of breaking it down like that, weave everything together. So for example, when it comes to decision-making, there are decision-making frameworks, there's data analysis, structured models. In Ascend, what I want to do is weave that into how we show up, how we connect, and how we take action, how we do those things and execute those skills, use those frameworks, but how do we show up as we do that? We spend more time on these frameworks in a full leadership program, but we have an hour today. So today is how we show up. And I want our discussion, and I want you to keep in mind how the different elements of Ascend, that's what's rooted in this conversation. So navigation. This supports decision-making by helping us make choices that reflect who we are and what we stand for. That's authenticity. Self-leadership. That's about understanding what drives us, manages our emotions. Connection. That is about relationships and how the decisions we make affect other people. And then how do we communicate those decisions in ways that are thoughtful and caring, considerate, etc. Empowerment. This is about creating space for others, bringing people into the decision-making process to a degree. We'll talk about that. And now navigation. I can see I had it out of order, right? Navigation is moving through moments when we don't have all the facts, because that's going to be a lot of the time. We don't always have perfect information. Sometimes we don't even have, I'll say, good information, gooder information. And then the last one is decisive action. And this is taking the clarity that we need and putting it into motion, owning our choices and being intentional as we move forward. All right, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different elements. However, there are really three main components or elements that stand out for me when it comes to decision making, specifically when it relates to building confidence around decision making, becoming more confident. The first is decisive action. So, being decisive doesn't necessarily mean being fast, it means being intentional. So, this is moving forward with clarity, even when you're not certain, right? Confidence does not come from waiting until you're sure about something. It's that courage where we can act even though we don't have all the answers. Sometimes you just have to make a decision and then be prepared to stand by it, even if you have to adjust later. Often we have to adjust later, right? Things change. We are in a quickly changing, rapid paced business environment. So you have to be ready to adjust. But in the meantime, you have to be able to just be decisive, make the decision, and go. The clarity that I'm referring to here is clarity of purpose, not clarity of outcome. Give me 2 seconds. I want to make sure I have the right, I want to make sure I can see the Q&A. All right, perfect. Sorry, folks. Okay, so what did I say? Not clarity of purpose, clarity of outcome. All right. Now, when I was preparing for this, I thought about a road trip that my husband and I took recently. So I'm going to share a couple of stories there. But before I share the story, I want to set it up, right? So you're going to take a trip. You know the destination. The first decision you need to make then is how are you going to get there? Now, I'm talking about being decisive, right? Well, there are a lot of things we need to think about first, like should you drive, fly, take the train? What's influencing your decision? Okay. Is it cost? Is it the price? Could it be different anxieties? Maybe somebody that you're traveling with is afraid of flying. Could it be simple preferences? Like, I know I enjoy this, looking out the window and watching the scenery pass by when you're driving or riding on the train. What about the dog? Do you bring them with you? Do you board them, hire a pet sitter, leave them home alone, hire a dog walker, pay for a few extra visits, like, the stay and play type visits? So that's a lot, right? So how do you decide? It's a 10-hour drive. Well, you weigh all of those options, as a good leader does. Each one of those small decisions lead you up to the main decision, and then you make the decision. You've factored in everything, including the capacity of those you'll be traveling with it in this case. I have small kids, or I do bring the dog, or maybe somebody in my traveling party has special needs, right? So I do all of that to make the plan. Being decisive doesn't mean being fast, but it means I make the decision and I move on. So I do that, right? We've made a couple of those decisions. We're comfortable with the decision. A lot of uncomfortable moments in the process, perhaps. There are a couple more things to think about here, right? So as a leader, you've made a decision, you've been decisive, but think about the fact that there may be some other quick decisions that you can already anticipate you're going to need to make, so you can almost prepare yourself and be ready. Example, you are driving, so that's the decision you've made. You know you're going to have to stop for gas. In general, do you plan to time it down to which exits? Are you going to grab food along the way, and that's going to be one of your planned stops? Do you want to take the scenic route in certain parts of the road? You get the idea. Now you're on the road. Things can go awry, right? So you're a leader, you've made this decision, and now off you go, and then all of a sudden, things go sideways. So you're flying, your flight's delayed, or you're driving, you come to a complete stop. And now you hear the emergency vehicles going by. You can maybe see them going by, but Waze, it hasn't updated, or whatever navigation software you're using, to show an actual delay. So you now have a decision to make. And oftentimes you want to be able to make that decision quickly. You see an off-ramp. Do you drive the shoulder? That's driving illegally, right? Do you drive the shoulder to get off, or do you wait for traffic to creep up? You get the point. There are a lot of little decisions that we have to make. Some have more consequences than others. Sometimes we can be uncomfortable as we navigate those decisions. All of that is okay. The other thing I want you to think about, Last point about the traveling. There are times when maybe I want to get the consensus. I'm going to ask everybody what they feel comfortable with. But no matter what I do, let's say at the family we're talking about here, the kids are in the backseat. They're watching and they're taking this all in. They aren't just waiting for you to make the decision. They're watching how you decide. And so that decisiveness is really important. And that gets us to the bottom line of all of this. Decisions, they come in all sizes. They have different levels of importance, consequence, and risk. But how we make them, how we move through them, how clear we are, and I will say, not confident internally, but externally, people see us taking clear and decisive action, especially when we do the big decisions, right? It's not unilateral. It doesn't mean we're rushing. It doesn't mean we're taking like too long. People are watching how we decide and how we show up in making those decisions, because leadership is going to be interpreted, how they perceive us as leaders is sometimes anyway interpreted through actions like decision making. It doesn't have to be big, bold moves, but we have to show that we can respond under pressure. We have to show that we can make a decision and then go with that decision, and that we're okay if we need to pivot. This is all part of our leadership signature, as I want to call it. They're watching what we do, and if we hesitate too long, especially on tough calls, we get into this over-analysis mode, and we might start breaking down trust. So this is really important, decisiveness. The next one is authenticity. So when we talk about authenticity in decision-making, we're talking about choices who reflect who you are, not who you think you're supposed to be or what you think others are expecting you to be. I hope I said that one right. It's about decisions that feel right to you, even if they don't necessarily make sense to others, and even if they're inconvenient, especially when they might go against what some might perceive to be practical. So for me, that shows up in a lot of little ways, but I'll give you an example around food on that road trip. So my husband and I earlier this year, actually, I think this was actually almost a year ago, we were driving back from South Carolina. We left painfully early in the morning. It was a weekend. It was a Sunday. And the goal was to avoid DC traffic. I live just north of Washington, DC. And if you know anything about here, the traffic is never good, even on a Sunday. So we decided to leave really early in the morning based on the drive time math. We didn't eat before we left. We were going to stop along the way. So about an hour or so into the drive, not only was it time to start thinking about getting gas, but it was time to eat, or more importantly, it was time for coffee. Now, authenticity for me means a quad grande soy extra hot latte. So if you know that language, that means Starbucks, right? So I'm nudging my husband to say, no, let's wait for the next pit stop. Not pit stop. Let's wait for the next exit, right? And I kept pushing to wait, because that is what was authentic for me. Starbucks, albeit not necessarily the best coffee, sorry, Starbucks, it was something that I do when I travel, because it brings me a sense of stability and routine in a time that feels very much out of routine, a sense of normalcy. So in the middle of a long trip, that's what I try to do whenever I'm traveling. It's very much me. And don't worry, my husband appreciates a good cup of coffee, so he was full in support. However, for someone else, they might have taken the first exit, grabbed whatever was available, and then kept going, because for them, what was most authentic and what mattered is getting there on time, making sure you're there to spend more time with family, or maybe they hate long delays. The thing about that is both of those decisions are valid. This is about being intentional. This is about being true to yourself and making a decision that is aligned with how you like to show up and what is a reflection of who you are. So these decisions, either way, are authentic. because they reflect the person making the call, your leadership signature, the leader you want to be. That's what is at the heart of authenticity in decision making. It's not about what it looks like from the outside. It's what's driving the decision from within. And by the way, I'll let you know. So we decided we were taking too long to find one with the Starbucks, so we just stopped. We passed several with the big brand names like Dunkin', Panera, like that kind of thing. They have okay coffee. They have good coffee. We decided, let's just stop. So we stopped, and guess what? No coffee shop. We got what I call truck stop coffee. We kind of laughed. You have to have a sense of humor. Guess what was at the next traffic stop? I'm just saying. Yes, the Starbucks was up at the next stop. I mean, you know what? You just can't make this stuff up. So that's okay. All right, moving on. Self-leadership. Janelle, pause. I'm going to look at the Q&A. Oh, okay. I thought I saw something come in. Did I? Nope. Okay. Sorry, folks. Drop them in here. I just want to make sure I'm not missing something. All right. Self-leadership. This is the last one I want to touch on. This is about managing yourself, emotions, mindset, energy before you make the decision. And while you're going through the process of making the decision, this is the space, self-leadership, between the stimulus and the response. And in leadership, this little space is where trust is built or broken. So when we talk about making a decision, right, something happens that requires us to start that process. We start the process here. And in between, there's just the quietest, littlest, teeniest moment where we have an opportunity to notice what we're going to need to do, notice perhaps the types of emotions we're having or the things that might be going on that are influencing our decision making. And if we're not paying close enough attention, we might flip into autopilot and react and not respond with intention and not move forward in a way that is aligned with what we want to do, how we want to show up, which means we are at risk of, dare I say, being emotional. And so self-leadership, I don't mean that in a dramatic way. Self-leadership is really about how we want to show up so that we can send very clear signals. So this doesn't have to be deep or dramatic. Sometimes this is in those quiet moments, in those small moments. So the last time, I'm going to go back to that road trip, right? The challenge with self-leadership in my case is I'm getting cranky, I'm tired, and what I don't want to do is have that change my behavior. It's not fair to my husband, and it's certainly not how I want to show up, right? So we've been on the road for a while, we're both getting hungry, we're tired, we still haven't had coffee. We've passed up many of those places. At a certain point, I know for me on that trip, I started to wonder if it's worth it. Right? There were plenty of coffee shops along the way, and they weren't necessarily bad coffee. They just weren't my grande, what is it? Quad grande soy extra hot latte. I should know that by heart, right? So the familiarity that I was talking about, that's what I wanted. But it was about me, I needed to shift into the us and we mindset. I couldn't let that crankiness take over, right? In that small moment of honesty, right? The moment that awareness popped into my head, that small moment, I realized it was time to give up on Starbucks and just take the next stop. If my husband was game, I had to be down for that too. This is what I mean by self-leadership. It's becoming aware in those little moments and making that mindset shift. Self-leadership is not what allows, no, self-leadership is what allowed me to make that pivot. I didn't have a plan, but what I had was awareness. I was noticing the crankiness, and I was starting to double down because I'll admit now, sometimes I can be a wee bit stubborn, right? So I was noticing that. And because of my ability to start to practice, I'll call this practicing what I preach, like by paying attention to those signals within myself, choosing how I wanted to show up in the middle of something as ordinary as stopping for a cup of coffee, right? Because that influences behaviors, thinking, emotions, reactivity, and all of that. Let's see. Andy shares, I know my patterns and they are not always what I know is best. Any suggestions on the way to break those patterns? Actually, yes. Coming up in a little bit, I have some 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 little examples of things you can do right away once you start to notice the patterns. The trick is noticing the patterns. And so if you want, folks, if you haven't, I encourage you to download not only the handout, the copy of the slides, but there are 2 other worksheets that I've included in there. One of them is specifically around noticing those patterns. So I'm really, really glad you asked that question. Okay, so I've talked about those different elements, how we weave decision making into those different components, the factors of ascend, right? Authenticity, self-leadership, etc. But I didn't do what I usually do, which is start with the definition. So let's look at that and think about the decision-making process itself, right? So the definitions: to make a final choice or judgment about something, to select something as a course of action, to infer on the basis of evidence, conclude, right? This is Merriam-Webster. And there are a couple of things in here that I find interesting. 2 words that jump out at me: judgment and infer. Now, I said a few times now, when you're uncertain, and those ideas are hidden in both of these words. So judgment is what we rely on when we don't have a clear answer. When there's no spreadsheet or formula to plug into, when we have to think about things like values and timing and context and people, because people, we're messy, right? We're thinking about all of this at one time. And there's no right answer. There's nothing obvious that's coming through. You kind of have to feel your way through. That's what I think about judgment. And that's what decision making feels like a lot of the times. The other word that jumped out at me was infer, because most of the time we're not deciding based on uncertainty. We're inferring. We're pulling together, almost cobbling together clues, reading the room, trusting our gut. That's the reality of leadership and decision making the best call we can with what we know, and then being ready to adapt if we're wrong. I don't even want to say wrong if we need to make a shift. So speaking for me, depending on the decision, there are a lot of different things that could pull at me: imposter syndrome, anxiety, feeling conspicuous, feeling invisible, right? All of these factors come into play when I'm talking about judgment and inferring. It's like analyzing the data and the numbers that tell us the answer. Gosh, if we could do that, it'd be so much easier. But in my experience, even when you have the numbers and even when you can narrow down the work, it only narrows it down to a few options. We still have to make a decision, right? And that's what decision making is. Really, it's not picking an option. It's choosing to move forward decisively. You might have option A or option B. You decide to go with, what did I say, A and B? You decide to go with B, and then quickly you pivot to A. That's what we're talking about here, is being able to move forward despite clarity. So judgment and infer, those are the 2 things that pop out at me. Now, when I hear the term decision making, I know for me, the first thing that came to mind is like big decisions, formal decisions, the stuff where we have a meeting, we do an analysis, it's the boardroom, someone makes a decision, and then that's the thing that we do. It's the call that we make as leadership. But that is really a narrow view of decision making, because as I said at the outset, we make a lot of decisions, often little ones, all the time. We don't even realize we're making decisions. How we respond in a tough moment, what we choose to say or not say, how we prioritize our time. When do we hold down and slow down and pause? When do we push through? All of these are decisions. And so what's interesting about subtle decisions, by the way, those quiet moments, those moments that other people don't see, they're subtle. And they're the ones that we make when we're on autopilot. but they're also a signal to others what our values are, because people notice how we move and shift, the things we say, the expressions we make, the decisions we make, right? And they tell other people what's important to us, what our values are, what I think is acceptable and appropriate. And so this is the other thing about all of those decisions, because remember I said earlier, sometimes silence is a decision, and that can convey a lot. Now, I organized different types of decisions. I kind of created these buckets. There's no formal grouping here, but I thought this made sense. So the first one is cognitive decision making. These are the decisions that live in our heads. We think something through, we're weighing, we're analyzing. This is the lifeblood of the accounting profession, right? This is what we do as a business. We make cognitive decisions for a living, but we also then ignore some of the other types of decision making. So, cognitive decisions are logical, they're data driven, they're decisions that we make like we're looking for something with clarity and structure. Emotional decisions, on the other hand, these are the ones we don't always talk about. This is feelings, not facts. If there were a type of decision we rarely talk about, it's emotional ones. They happen often, they happen quickly. Sometimes they happen without us realizing it. I said earlier, maybe it's something like intuition. Sometimes we're just immediately doing something to avoid, right? Choosing not to respond to that email right away because it triggered you and you want to make sure that you have the right tone, or feeling like you say yes to something because you should, but not necessarily because it feels right. There's relational decision making. This is more about interpersonal communication and connection, how we interact with other people. So those are the decisions that aren't just about what to do, but they're about how well other people will receive it, react to it, or how it might impact them. So these are those moments around connection, the see and ascend. These are those moments where we think about things like, do we tell the backstory? Do we speak up when we disagree? Think of these as some of those social type decisions. And then the last one is situational. So situational decision making, these are the ones that happen in motion. In the moment, they're sort of dynamic. You don't always get to think them through. You're reading the room and you're making a call and then you're moving forward. They're highly contextual decisions, and you're responding to timing, to tone, what happened 5 minutes ago, where you think the group is going next. Okay, so these are the different types of decisions we make. And hopefully, as you're looking through this, you're realizing, yeah, I've made several of these decisions in the last hour. There's no right or wrong, but this is part of building awareness so that we can start to understand those patterns. There are internal drivers. So what's going on behind the scenes? So we know we're making these types of decisions, but what's influencing that, right? So I already said, but it bears repeating. Confidence isn't the same as certainty. Confident leaders aren't always sure, but they move forward even when they're not. Okay. But what are the things that affect that? Well, let's start with personality. If you're someone who's risk averse, maybe you take longer to decide. And this isn't because you can't choose, but you're trying to protect against, all the possible outcomes. On the other hand, if you're somebody that leans toward perfection, right, you tend to wait to get as close to 100% ready before you make a decision, even when 80% is enough. Now, reminding you now, this isn't a flaw. I'm trying to understand what is driving me so that I can start to pick up on what might be underlying those as patterns. The next one is emotional intelligence. What about this is your ability to recognize what's driving your behavior. So do you know when fear is starting to show up? Maybe that's over-researching something. Could it be when self-doubt is making you delegate instead of decide? Or can you tell when your gut feeling is real or is it anxiety? Somebody put in here, sometimes you have to trust your gut. Yes. And you want to make sure that if you look back and you think about the patterns that you exhibit, the way you show up, the way you are wired, if you will, do you tend to be reactive, right? That's important when you're thinking about trusting your gut. Past experience, especially when you think about, well, the last time I made the decision, it didn't go well. So I tend to rely on that as a way to make a decision moving forward. That there's some narratives that we think about that we start to develop in our head that then influence moving forward. And then we have expectations. Your team's expectation, your boss, the culture that you work in, the workplace norms, right? Some environments, they reward bold behavior. Some punish that. Some environments create space to lead. Others second guess every call you make. And all of this is going to shape some of those internal narratives that I was talking about. So you pull all of things together. When you start to think of this, well, then what do we mean by decision-making confidence? Well, it's all of these things that can help us do things like understand the decision I need to make. Do I feel like I know what I'm doing? Am I clear-headed? Am I imagining things? If this doesn't go well, can I handle the outcome? Am I leaning on others to inform me of decision, or am I making sure that I'm owning that with a sense of agency? So all of these play a role. This isn't a good or bad thing. It affects how well and how grounded we feel when we make those choices. Because confidence isn't about being fearless necessarily. It's just about being able to move forward despite the discomfort. That's the biggest thing that holds us back when it comes to decision-making confidence. Some of that hesitancy isn't because I don't have a sense of what I want to do. It's feeling comfortable doing it. Now let's talk about those hesitations then, so we can start to think about the patterns. The reality is leaders are expected to move, make a decision, do it quickly, communicate it clearly, stand by it publicly, adjust when things need to shift. Now, doing all of that, and when you're unsure, you don't feel grounded, you're still wrestling with self-doubt, that imposter syndrome, vulnerability combination that I was talking about earlier. So this is going to be the reason we hesitate, and it's going to show up in a couple of different ways. Again, I created a couple buckets here. So the first one is you're afraid you're going to get it wrong. And so this can be really hard for those of us who are used to being right, if you will, or you've had to work really hard to earn your credibility. So your fear here is that if you make a mistake, it's going to cost you. People are going to say you're not as competent, or maybe you feel like you lose credibility, or maybe you're worried you're going to lose someone's trust. So instead of making a call, making a decision, you freeze, you delay, you keep putting it off, right? And we are trying to put it on someone else, perhaps. There might be all kinds of reasons that we are avoiding or hesitating because of that fear. The next one is overthinking or stalling. And this one can be easy to justify, especially in our profession. I just need to run more data. I need to make sure I've done the right analysis. I want to get somebody to review this again, perhaps. We convince ourselves that if we analyze just a little longer, we'll get to the answer, and that'll make things clear. It's important to know, however, clarity doesn't always come from information. To some degree, that trust your gut instinct. To some degree, that is always going to be true. The challenge with overthinking is that if it starts to become a habit, it might appear to be a thoughtful pause at first, but perhaps it escalates to the point of paralysis. Or avoiding discomfort. This one's personal, right? I don't mean about me specifically. I mean, it's personal to us. It shows up when we know that there's a decision that we need to make, but we're not ready to feel the consequences of the decision. So we delay. We are waiting for the right moment, or we tell ourselves we're being diplomatic, but deep down, we are avoiding the emotional cost, that hard conversation, the disappointment, the awkwardness, right? And in the process, we just kind of let time slip by. And then this last bucket here that I created, that I put here, is seeking external validation. Now, this one shows up when we're feeling unsure and we want someone else to tell us we're right. So we start asking around, not always for insight. Sometimes it's just for reassurance. We look for signs that other people agree with us, so we feel safe moving forward. I mean, have you ever been in a situation where you need to ask how many people agree with this? but you make sure you already know, everybody agrees before you ask the question. That's what we mean here by seeking external validation. Collaboration and input are important, but validation can become a bit of a crutch. And so when we rely on other people to confirm our choices, we're essentially outsourcing our confidence, if you will. Now, these patterns are understandable because they tend to be a bit protective, but the longer we hesitate, the more we can chip away at our own confidence. And we start to believe that we can't decide. There goes the negative self-talk and the narrative, right? That for whatever the fill-in-the-blank reason, we're not the kind of person who makes these hard calls. Now, the flip of that is false confidence, which can be dangerous. That's when we move too fast. We don't necessarily check in. We just push forward because we can, not because we should. We risk arrogance, overreach, decisions that can be dismissive, that might compromise ethics. It could have long-term consequences that we didn't think through. So this is where I'm going to pause and invite you all sort of just thinking about the things that I said. We'll talk about those pitfalls in a moment. But if you had to pick one of these as your biggest sticking point, I'm curious what it will be. So I'm going to pause and see if anybody is open to sharing that in the Q&A. Gabe, when people put things in Q&A, is it anonymous to everyone else, or can everybody see everybody's question?
It's anonymous.
Okay, good, because I was afraid. Don't type in here if it's not anonymous, right?
Yeah.
You don't want that. Don't tattle on yourself.
No, you definitely have that protection.
Yes, thank you. All right, so a couple people are starting to respond. It's fear of getting it wrong. I guess I suffer from that one a bit. Overthinking. Let's see. Fear of getting it wrong again. Avoiding discomfort. Seeking external validation. Thank you all for dropping these in here. Analysis paralysis is it for me. Overthinking. In our profession, what's interesting about this is for any number of reasons, we might fall into any of these traps. There's one perhaps that we fall into more than another, but it's really about recognizing what do all of these things mean in terms of behavior. So now what do we do about it? Well, the pitfalls, right? This is what I'm talking about then. What does it look like in action? How does all of this play out in reality? So these are just some of the common ones. Excuse me. So for example, seeking consensus or validation, I've talked about that. We keep polling the group, like we keep asking for someone's opinion. We just want to check in one more time before we make the call. Because getting input is valuable. But if you notice you keep asking the question, that's hesitation dressed up as inclusion, if you will. Confusing delegation and collaboration. Collaboration is important because we want to make sure we're inviting in others. But you're telling yourself perhaps that you are empowering others when you're really just trying to sidestep the decision and allow others to make it. There's a bit of avoidance here. Fast does not equal good. And oftentimes we feel pressure as leaders to go faster. But what we want to make sure is we're being thoughtful. Fast isn't always thoughtful, but it doesn't necessarily mean it isn't thoughtful. We just want to be careful about that. So you really want to think through all of these things because we want to make sure that if I struggle with overthinking, then I make sure part of it isn't, fourth one down, I'm not reflecting on past decisions, and so I tend to keep repeating the same analysis. Stress testing rejected options is a good one because oftentimes we're focused on did we make the right one, but one of the ways that can help you validate that is to look and see, well, let me review the ones I rejected. Because what's interesting, some of the best ideas we have are the ones we walked away from, right? If I had only gone back and just double checked why I chose not to go with this option, I might realize after all of the reflection and thinking it through, actually, that's a pretty good idea, right? So again, these aren't flaws. These are the signals that we want to look for so we can figure out what do I need to do to interrupt the pattern. So how do we do that then? Avoiding pitfalls. Now, We've talked about the things that can undermine confidence, but we also need to talk about what do you do with that, because these patterns will sneak in. This is human nature. We are creatures of habit. We learn to do things quickly because we master something and move on. But that automaticness, I don't think that's a word, but that automaticness is where we can get in trouble. Now, here's the funny thing about working on self-awareness. We start thinking about this, we identify the patterns, we recognize some of those pitfalls. And so we want to start recognizing when we're doing it. So you're paying attention, you're being aware. This is great, but now you notice you're doing it. So now what do? Right? Like, I've learned and put a lot of effort into what not to do. So this is why it's important to have strategies of what to do. So these are some little things that you can do. One of the things I would encourage you to think about is, if you know your pattern, once you notice it, just come up with two things, two go-to activities or strategies that you can do as you start to learn how to navigate forward in ways that help you build up your confidence and not continue to second guess, right? So I put these into 4 broad categories. So one of them falls under the category of self-awareness. One is about clarity. One is about decision discipline. Let me say this clearly. And then the other one is external input, right? So self-awareness, that's the little hourglass thing here. Pause and name it. What do I mean here? It sounds kind of simple, but it's kind of powerful. You start to notice that tension rising and you catch yourself. And that's when you sort of pause for a moment and say, what's really going on here? Can you name the emotion? It's surprisingly difficult to do. But if you can name that emotion, sometimes the very language of that helps unlock what's holding you back, and you can shift. The next one is set a decision deadline. And I will say I've tried this. Perhaps it doesn't work as well for me, but it might work well for you. So if you tend to spin, right, give yourself a deadline. I'm going to have this done by Friday at noon. And then trust yourself to follow through. I will tell you that when I have set some deadlines, depending on what I'm doing, I find that as soon as I've passed that deadline, I start urging myself to get to the decision. So that can be helpful for some. Under clarity, I have lead with values. What do I mean here is we want to make sure that our decisions are anchored in our values, even when they're not usual, when the decision isn't necessarily easy. So what values help us do is create clarity of action and confirm that we can move forward. Okay. Self-trust. What does this one mean? This one takes a little time because it's personal, but it's getting to just remind yourself, I can handle this. I can do this, even if it doesn't go perfectly, right? That you believe that you can make changes and that you can move. So it unlocks this fear that you might have that you need to get it right. Acknowledge that you might not always get it right, and that's okay. Decision discipline. The reality check is that if you find yourself spiraling or whatever, if you could say to myself, well, what is it that I actually know? And what is it that I'm assuming? And if you can start to separate those two things, it can sort of draw you out of the fog, if you will, and then focus on the things you know. Assess the real risk. This one can be harder if you're a perfectionist, because every decision has trade-offs. The question is really here, what's at stake? And what's just my internal fear talking? Every risk isn't a deal breaker, but sometimes we avoid decisions because we're magnifying something in our head. So means it's almost like putting it on paper, not quite pros and cons, but real and not so real. And then the last one is external input. So this is about getting support. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to seek input. It's okay to invite collaboration, asking everybody in the car, do you want to stop? Or should we just take the next pit stop and do the scenic route, right? It's okay to do that. But what you don't want to do is give away your power, so to speak. And by that, I mean the tendency, and this is particularly true if you're newly promoted into leadership or you don't feel as confident. This is the tendency to outsource. I used that word before, the decision making. You're doing this through the name of collaboration. So it could be waiting for someone else to agree before you move forward. It can be you really need somebody's approval. That's what helps you feel more confident. Or here's one that I know I've done, which is, I just sort of defer to the loudest voice in the room, even when my gut is telling me otherwise, because it would be so uncomfortable to do otherwise. Some other ideas, the last two ideas here are using a sounding board. So this isn't the same as getting validation. This is where you ask somebody to help you think it through. So they're not telling you what to do, but maybe they're asking questions, they're reflecting back what you're hearing so that you can start to see that more clearly. And then getting an outside perspective, this is, talking it through with somebody. It could be a mentor, it could be a peer, it could be someone in a completely different department or organization. Confidentiality respected, of course, because a fresh lens, a fresh perspective can help you think of things you hadn't considered. And I know I've done that a lot. So these are just a few ideas. You probably can think of more. You might have heard some, like reframe the decision. Reframe the decision. How did I move my mouse? Okay, I think that's where we are. All right, so I'm looking at the time. I want to make sure I get through this. Is there anything else I wanted to share here? Because I moved my mouse. I had a couple of other ideas. Oh, this one idea. I had a note. I don't want to forget this one. So one of the ideas that I had is, and I know I've done this, is you flip the script, right? Like you think, well, what would I tell someone else were they trying to make this decision? Because what's fascinating about when you flip the question and reverse it, if you will, it's so much easier to see it when somebody else is making this decision than when I'm making the decision. And when you can do that, you can gain some objectivity and reassurance and feel a little bit more confident in the decision you're making. It can help you create distance, if you will, from that inner chatter that's happening, that inside voice. And, that's one of the ways to practice some self-compassion and give yourself a little grace. It's okay to be struggling, but being able to make the decision despite the struggle, that's what we have to do if we're going to be in leadership roles. And then there's the good old-fashioned one, right? Sleep on it. Don't rush. It could be pause on it, right? So it could be, you know what, I'm going to just go grab a cup of coffee and I'm going to do a quick walk around the block and I'm going to sort of think this through. This can be particularly important when you need to make a quick decision because you don't have time. All right, uncertainty. What are some things you can do when you're navigating uncertainty? Because we don't always have all the facts. Sometimes we'll never get all the facts. Sometimes we'll get them, but we won't get them in time, right? So you have to be able to move forward despite that. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. A couple of ideas here, right? Use the best information you can find. Don't wait till it's 100%. 80% is better than waiting until you have the best information. What do you know and what's most important? Because not all information is of equal value. So what about that? Is it reversible? This is important because if it's reversible or if it's low risk, you don't need to overanalyze. You decide, you try it, you adjust. If it's high stakes, if it's hard to walk back, that's when you need to slow down. Directional clarity. This is about remembering you just need to know what the next few steps are so that you can get the ball rolling. If this is the type of decision where you don't need to have the full answer or you don't even know the destination, you're just trying to move forward. Collective insight. This is bringing others in, gathering perspective, making sure you're the one still accountable and driving the car, right? What do I know? What is information that I can't get these answers? Because once you identify what's not knowable, you can set it aside. So these are a lot of different things you can think about when you're navigating uncertainty. You just want to make sure that you have a strategy so that you can understand, oh, this is what I'm doing. Let me try not to do this by it's good enough for now. Right? And then moving forward and being okay with that. Right now, folks, I'm giving you permission to say, you know what? This is good enough. Let me move forward and then pivot when I need to. It's a strong leader. Now, I said at the outset, don't worry, I'm not spending a lot of time here. I said at the outset, right, There are a lot of different structured decision-making frameworks and models, and it's important for you to know these because these are fantastic and even important tools for navigating complex decisions, or even when you go to make group decisions, collaborative decisions, because they give you a shared language. I'm not explaining all of these to you. I mean, I can give you the very short descriptions, but that's why I put them on the slide, right? When you have a framework, it can help you do the work. But what I've been talking about today is how do you navigate the feelings, the hesitancy, the confidence, the perhaps lack of clarity while you're doing the work. We always talk about how to do the 2x2 grid, but we don't talk about what I struggle with in trying to do the analysis. And so that's what we're really focusing on, is recognizing that internal process so that we can cross the, what do you call it? Jump the hurdle, cross the finish line, right? With confidence. That's the trick. So confidence then, what does this all mean when you take it as a whole? It's like a muscle that you develop and grow and get stronger all the time. It's not just a mindset. It's not just personality. It's something that we can develop with a little bit of practice. There'll be ups and downs, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 10 steps forward, 2 steps back. I could keep going, but I won't, right? So it's all of these things, practice and repetition. Confidence comes from doing something again and again. It breeds familiarity. Familiarity builds trust. Self-trust grows into confidence. I've been here before. I can do this, right? Self-awareness. Well, I've touched on that a lot. Confidence comes when you start to understand yourself and you know your strengths, you know where you struggle, and you have an identity, you have identified something you can do when the struggle starts to show up, right? I go and I seek external, I get some external input and feedback. Emotional regulation, I've touched on that a couple of times. Leadership is uncomfortable. Let's just face it, right? But confidence allows you to feel your emotions. Confidence means you can navigate and feel those emotions. In the last session, we talked about emotional intelligence. That's exactly what we're talking about here. We don't want to overreact. We want to manage our reactions. Values alignment, I've talked on that a couple of times now. Understanding your values allows for some internal stability so you can trust yourself more with your choices. And then recovery and compassion, because listen, sometimes these decisions are hard. Sometimes it costs you. And so this gives you the space to bounce back, if you will. I put on a grid here then, just as a quick recap. When we do these things consistently, we can become more confident in our decision making. So practicing through repetition, we trust we can do the process again. Understanding our values makes it clearer, more thoughtful, and aligned. This is how we build confidence. Now, like I said before, you hopefully download these and use them. The Leadership Decision Tool Journal. It's 3 pages. The first couple of pages help you think about what's going on in your mind as you make a decision today. But then there's a page where you can reflect back. Maybe it's 6 weeks later, maybe it's 6 months later. So you think about, what did you actually decide and what did you learn from that decision that you can take forward? So the journal is something, you could just use it as a tool. And the decision trap spotter, this is trying to identify your patterns. And once you identify your patterns, starting to think about specific ways for you that you can interrupt those patterns. All right, so we have a couple of minutes before we wrap up. Let me go look at the Q&A. Oh, so I think I've addressed most of them. One here is, I know my patterns are not always what I know is best. Any suggestions on ways to break those patterns? So if you know you're doing something and you know what you're doing is probably not the best, speaking just for me, my go-to strategy in that case is I have a safe person. So I have somebody, and okay, so 2 people come to mind for me. One is my husband, actually, and then the other one is a long-time mentor for me. And I can go to him. I'll name him Bob, because if I gave his real name, well, you wouldn't know, but he would know. So, well, he knows. But anyway, Bob, right? So Bob has years of experience. He's walked the walk. in the experience that he has, I followed a lot in that experience, right? So he was in public accounting. He was a partner in a CPA firm. He's moved on into other roles similar to my roles. And I know I can go to him and say, I'm doing it again. Help me. I need help. Help get me out of this. I need your feedback. I need some input. And so when I'm struggling, some of the time, I know for me, I don't want other people to know I'm struggling, right? Because there's this idea that for leadership, nobody can know. What is that commercial? Never let them see you sweat. That's not true. And so that is one suggestion I'll make, because I know that that works for me, and I hope that that helps you. With that, as we come to wrap up, I will say that, as I mentioned, this is a monthly series. Next month, Facilitating Difficult Conversations. It just opened up for registration yesterday. You can scan this QR code if you jump to the registration page, or you can visit my website. I have the entire schedule on my website. Fourth Friday of every month from 3 to 4. Each session builds on the fundamentals that we talked about in the last session. I hope you can join me. I will wrap up by saying, I mentioned that I have stuff that we cover, those models in the full leadership program. If you're interested in learning more about any individual program or the overall leadership program, scan this QR code and you literally can just drop some time on my calendar, or send me an email, message me on LinkedIn. So that's it. Thanks. Okay. Thanks everyone for joining me, and I hope to see you next time.